Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel Prize winner, was one of the exceptions. And he said, look, we're trying to make these people go cold turkey. They haven't lived in a true free market ever in their lives. It was a catastrophe. You put all of this together and you eventually end up with Putin. And Putin comes in as seen as someone who understands what a catastrophe it is and is willing to take steps to address it. It takes him many years. Whether we like Putin or not, whether you approve it, it's all irrelevant. The truth is that he's a Russian patriot and is viewed as one by most of the people in Russia. And he pulled Russia out of a terrible situation. And he's going to the oligarchs.
Yeah.
And these are the people that raped Russia when they had the opportunity to do so. And most of them now are living outside the country because they had to leave or they were going to end up being imprisoned or executed.
Yeah, fleeing to the UK. I'd read that, if I recall, there was even some Senate or congressional hearings in the 90s into this looting of Russia that related to a lot of the crew out of Harvard, the Harvard crew, these kinds of economist people who then sort of divvied up and figured out how to, with the collusion of these people, privatize and sort of buy off and rape Russia, so to speak. And then that's what led to the era of Putin that you're talking about. And that's really just objective factuality. It's looking at the situation objectively. It's not trying to run propaganda here, which is really what we see so much, especially in the West, that the media is just wild. I mean, it's every day. It's the most ridiculous stories for the last 8 months. Well, even going back to 2014, portraying Putin as Hitler when, I mean, this is so contrary to the, fundamentals of the history of Russia, fighting Hitler in World War II to portray.
When you go, Jay, if you look for a minute, this thing called the Azov Regiment and these Nazis that are running around in Ukraine, these people, in most cases, have no idea what they're doing. In other words, they're fascinated with the Nazi mystique that they heard from their grandfathers or whatever, because the Germans were widely viewed as liberators. But people don't know the whole story. There were 1.5 million Soviet citizens in the German Wehrmacht, 750,000 Russians, 250,000 Ukrainians, and another 500,000 people who were Tartars, Mongols, Turks, Georgians, Armenians, and so forth. These people were happy to join the war on communism. And Hitler's great failure, of course, was to take advantage of that. There were millions of former Soviet soldiers in prison camps that Marshal Vlasov wanted to organize as into Russian armies of liberation to go out and fight shoulder to shoulder with the Wehrmacht. They had plenty of Russian equipment they'd captured or Soviet equipment that they could equip them with. It didn't happen. But I think people don't understand the scale of anger and hatred. Well, all of this is suppressed. It begins to come out in the 90s. Brzezinski understood that, wanted to put forward some sort of solution. Now, people will say he's fundamentally anti-Russian. Fine, he is. And he wanted to do harm to Russia, perhaps. But no one was really interested in dealing with it. And tragically, you had a similar situation in 1919 at Versailles. Nobody at Versailles understood Eastern Europe. It was a black hole. It was just this vast area ruled by the Tsar with millions and millions of people that no one knew anything about or understood, that were not really, in the view of most people sitting at Versailles, part of the so-called West. And whenever the Germans and Austrians and Hungarians would step forward and try to explain things, they were sort of told, thanks, we don't care. So everything we see now begins in 1919 with misguided solutions. It gets much worse as a result of World War II because Stalin did terrible things, changed borders, pushed millions of people around, killed tens of millions. So here we sit, and we've had all the wrong people intervene into this thing for reasons that make no sense, in my judgment. People that see some benefit to destroying Russia, to dismember it, to steal its resources. I don't see any benefit to anybody to doing that. And most of all, the principal victims right now, once again, are Ukrainians, because they've been mobilized and pushed into a war that I don't think they needed to fight. I mean, if you go back to 29 March and look at what was on the table then from the Russians, what they wanted, it was something that the Ukrainians could have accepted easily. Number one, of course, was neutrality. Neutrality, don't join NATO, they frankly didn't care about the EU, but they said, look, you can't join NATO. That's off the table. Be neutral. Number two, the two autonomous republics need to be autonomous. They need to be allowed to govern themselves, and they'll stay inside Ukraine. The rest of the Russians that live in Ukraine, there were millions of them, need to be allowed to speak their language, go to school, learn in their language. In other words, live lives with equal rights before the law. And then finally, stop the nonsense about Crimea. It's never been, quote unquote, really part of Ukraine. It's Russian. We're not giving it up. We've controlled it since the 1770s. That was what they wanted. And then they said, we would like to have a representative of the Kremlin sitting on the National Defense Council of Ukraine. We're simply interested in that. We want to make sure that you abide by essentially the Austrian-style treaty that would be being implemented in Ukrainian neutrality. And the Russians, by the way, maintained somebody like that in Vienna, Austria for many years after the state treaty was signed. It all fell apart. We didn't want it. Zelensky is just a mouthpiece for Washington and the oligarchs, and he's rejected everything. And so here we are. And people are saying, oh, well, the Ukrainians are winning. And the Ukrainians have been winning now since 24 February.
I was going to say that's what the media has. Yeah, the media has constantly said this. Like, we keep hearing, oh, Putin's lost, Putin's lost, Putin's lost. And then why are they having to keep saying this if he lost,
or the Russians have run out of ammunition. The Russians have run out of this, run out of that, and the Russians can't bring in any more troops. It's all nonsense. Yeah. But from the very beginning, Putin, I think, made some invalid assumptions. Mm-hmm. First of all, he used a very small force because he believed that once he demonstrated that he was serious, that there would be a willingness to negotiate. I think he actually believed that. He also gave strict instructions to his commanders. I don't want to kill civilians. I don't want to destroy infrastructure. We want to minimize all of that with the hope of getting out of this with the minimal conditions that I just described. And after all, this is a brother Slavic country. This is another Slavic country like Russia. We're not interested in murdering Slavs. We don't want to do this. Well, all of that went by the wayside. But he played along until the summer. And then in the summer, he had a come to Jesus meeting with his military commanders. And they were never comfortable with what he wanted to do because they didn't believe in it. So he had to make a number of changes. And he now has a theater commander, this man, Surovikin. And essentially what he has said, conditions have changed. We will now treat Ukraine as a war zone. That's very important because they haven't done that.
Yeah.
They never had more than 20% of the Soviet armed forces engaged in this conflict. That's changed. You're going to have as many as 700,000 Russian forces in and around Ukraine before this thing is over. That includes the 300,000 mobilized reserves, but it also includes virtually all of the professional army and the Air Force and so forth. And we're going to end this war. The only way it can end is if we go in and we absolutely eradicate the armed forces. They keep talking about denazification, which is not unreasonable because the Ukrainians, particularly these Nazis, have committed a number of terrible atrocities against Russian soldiers and Russian civilians. We don't cover it. We don't talk about it. In fact, Sky News and CNN were both, I don't know if it's permanent, but temporarily stripped of their news credentials inside Ukraine because they showed pictures of people with Nazi insignia and giving Heil Hitler salutes on the way into Kherson. The place the Ukrainians are now trying to convince everybody they liberated when in fact the Russians simply chose to temporarily withdraw. So here we sit and we're waiting for this winter. We're waiting for the ground to freeze. And people don't understand that Ukraine, the black soil of Ukraine, is very deep. It varies from 4 feet deep up to 12 or 15 feet deep, depending upon where you are. This is the breadbasket. You were talking about Ukraine's criticality to the Germans in World War II. Absolutely. They very definitely were concerned about it because 400,000 Germans had starved to death during World War I as a result of the British blockade. So they wanted to be sure that they would produce enough food for everyone during the Second World War. And in fact, they did. Up until the war ended, everybody in Germany ate. So there are reasons why people went in and did things. And the attitudes of Ukrainians were not uniformly pro-Hitler, and they were not uniformly supportive of Stalin or against Stalin. but large numbers were very pleased to have the Germans administer the country. I interviewed large numbers of them back in the 1980s. They were still alive when I was in graduate school. And I used to say, well, what was the difference between Stalin and Hitler? Said under Stalin, they stole our land. We